This program was first broadcast on Otago Access Radio and made with the assistance of New Zealand On Air.
Sustainable Lens, Resilience on Radio. Hear an informed, intelligent and provocative discussion of issues every week as seen through the lens of sustainability. It is brought to you by Otago Polytechnic, where all students learn how to make their industries more sustainable. It is hosted by Samuel Mann and Shane Gallagher, and joined every week by a leading figure in the sustainability scene. Sustainable Lens, Resilience on Radio, broadcast every week on Otago Access Radio, and podcast on sustainablelens.org and on oar.org.nz.
Tonight our guest is Dr. Stephen Atkins, and he started off training as an astronomer with an aim to actually become an astronaut. Now, I had actually looked up Stephen's credentials on the internet, and then we started talking just before the show and found out he's so much more interesting than on the internet would lead you to believe. So he started training as an astronomer because he wanted to become an astronaut, and then or pilot, test pilot, and then
pilot, astronaut.
All round, the right guy.
He's the right stuff.
Right stuff. Unfortunately, something happened and he wasn't able to.
Didn't have the right stuff.
But it was purely physiological.
Accident of birth. And then he decided that, well, he's had all his training, so he got involved with the space program, and he's actually worked with the astronauts, developing programs to train, to take an average test pilot and turn that man and woman into an astronaut. And that's what he did for a long time in the United States. And he took all these skills, and he was working as a postdoc. You did your doctorate at Virginia Tech, and you then were an academic instructor, and then you started working as an assistant manager lecturer at a government polytechnic in America, and you were teaching engineering management students from nations of every continent. And most of them were getting master's degrees in logistics management, systems management, and systems engineering. And now Steve has moved to Dunedin, and we'll find out why he's done that, because coming from somewhere as exotic and exciting as NASA and get involved in space tech, why would you come to little old Dunedin at the bottom of the world? And he teaches here industrial psychology, business research methods, cognitions for social marketing, psychology of brain drain, brain gain, and brain waste, personality fit in the workplace, and looking at large sample online volunteerism. Project teams are looking at large sample online volunteerism with projects like Smart Aid and consultants without costs. So tell me, what got you? Why did you want to become an astronaut, Steve? what was that? Was it like me when I was a kid and it was like, heard all about Neil Armstrong, who's unfortunately passed away this week. You know, that whole magic, idea of the spacecraft going up to the moon. That was just my dream.
Yeah, I don't think there was anything different really in what would give me that same ambition, and it was a fairly common ambition for folks in my age group, and in growing up at the time of the launches. We were just old enough to have rather permanent and concrete memories from getting up on the mornings of the initial space launches with Alan Shepard and John Glenn, so that if you were just starting to be of primary school age when the space program was just starting off, well, it was the obvious ambition to have, really. So if you were reasonably athletic in those primary school years, and you had and you could tolerate and really enjoy flying, and you could handle science and get good grades in it, well, amongst that subset of that intersection, it would be pretty common to at least keep in the back of your head, if I'm really good at all those things at the same time, maybe I could be an astronaut. Yeah.
You started learning to fly at a very young age.
Yes, I think I took my first glider lessons at age 12, almost 13. I was probably had soloed an aircraft by my 15th birthday. In fact, I know from my first solo cross countries where you had to fly at some distance and do sort of a triangle-shaped pattern and visit airports you'd never been to before. solo. My parents were still having to drive me to the airport to do this, as wasn't old enough to get a driver's license. So, it was fairly early on, but the problem with that kind of flying is that it doesn't predict well that you'll be able to handle high-performance aircraft. And if you want to be an astronaut, you're going to have to train in high-G, high-performance aircraft. And that's where a birth defect in my inner ear kicked in and took over and put me onto a different path. So, but I never lost my fascination for the space program, and that's why I majored in astronomy. I at the time I chose that major, I was still thinking I was going to be a pilot and someday a test pilot and maybe an astronaut. So that was still hard news, and I had to hit the job market, so to speak, with an astronomy degree. But fortunately, I was able to get a good job in the space program, working as an industrial safety engineer at a launch pad, because most of the other engineers there, really none of the engineers wanted to be the safety guy. And they thought, well, we've hired you, but since you don't yet have an engineering degree, I was working on one at night school, but they said, when you get your real engineering degree, we'll talk about another kind of work. So right now, you get to be the safety weenie. And that actually connected well to my concerns about the environment. I like Sam Mann here, I probably bought into green arguments very, very early as a teenager. And one of my primary role models in high school was our high school's first real salient greenie. And so becoming a safety engineer at a launch pad where lots of dangerous rocket propellants and dangerous vapors occasionally have to be vented, we were all on hazardous duty pay as a bonus pay because we were being exposed to carcinogens. Some of these chemicals were so nasty that a single inhaled breath of the stuff would kill you by a slow, agonizing death over several days. I mean, really nasty stuff that we don't use, to my knowledge, anywhere else except in the space business. We have lots of exotic materials we have to use there. So it was very interesting work, and it did eventually win me a scholarship to go off to Arizona State University, where I did a master's in engineering that was sponsored by the NASA Space Station office. And that was a wonderful turn of events. They provided a lot of support for my research, and that led to a job for 4 years working on a series of astronaut performance experiments for the space shuttle. The idea there being to try to identify what particular unique values astronauts might have that could compete with the best things we could do with unmanned sensor platforms. And that was the purpose of that, really. And it was a fascinating part of my life.
Now, you actually worked with people training to be astronauts, or did you actually work with astronauts as well?
I worked with both. And when I'd say training to be astronauts, I think I'd say I worked with people who were aspiring to be astronauts. So I worked with test pilots who also wanted to work with the astronaut office, and they wanted to be engaged with this program that I was working with. But the people who actually executed the experiments on orbit, of course, were astronauts. And there were astronauts attending many of the technical interchange meetings or engineering meetings we would have in designing those. So I can't really take much credit at all for the scientific content of the experiments, because the astronauts we worked with were also excellent scientists in themselves, or excellent engineers, and they certainly knew how to design human performance experiments. So it was a team effort, and an amazing experience.
That has a kind of a very how shall I say, obvious link to some of the business psychology / performance stuff that you've been doing in New Zealand. What brought you to New Zealand in the first place? What was your... Because it's an odd place to end up.
It is.
You've skipped a PhD.
That's right.
It's just the life story police here.
Okay. Let's wind back. You get your PhD at Virginia Tech?
That's right.
That's right.
Yeah. Sorry.
I want to get that in.
Okay. That's it. Virginia Tech, the Hokies, and Hokie Gobblers were called. I guess I had won a doctoral scholarship in industrial psychology. I was working in the overlap between industrial psychology and industrial engineering in the end, and that overlap, one of those overlaps, is in what we call work analysis or competency modeling. This is largely quantitative analysis of what talents are required by a job. So that blended well with my work with the astronaut program, because that likewise we were looking at what sort of talents or skills astronauts bring to bear in a space platform that would be difficult to replace with unmanned systems. So I've always been interested in, for some reason, in vocational talent requirements and offering free career guidance to anyone who wants to listen to me about how their particular skill sets match up with the world of work. It's maybe an unusual interest, but it is a chronic and recurring one with me. So it led to a doctoral scholarship in industrial psychology, where I still focused on the intersection between industrial psychology and industrial engineering, and studied under Professor R.J. Harvey, one of the world's leading experts in work analysis or talent requirements, competency modeling sometimes called. And that led to an academic career that eventually saw me interviewed by Massey University in New Zealand. So my wife and I had lived overseas for briefly. Once we had done that, we spent all of our holiday time trying to get back to overseas locations. America is okay in spots, especially university towns like where Virginia Tech is, Blacksburg, absolutely wonderful. Indiana University, where I did my undergrad, Bloomington, Indiana, great places. I always say to people who, Kiwis especially, if they think about living in America, I say, well, try to focus on one of the 3 or 4 dozen Dunedins that we have. They're lovely places to live. And paradoxically, the very best would be university towns in a very conservative state. Because in a very conservative state, the university town is the only place where many of the liberals and gays and sophisticated people and people who can think will feel comfortable living. Right? So they congregate there, and there's lots of culture. So the cultural opportunities for the size of the town are amazing. And Dunedin's the same way. Look at the things we have here. Most of the things here, I think you'd have to have a city of 1.5 million in the States to have the sorts of cultural amenities we have here. So that same sort of idea. So we were focused on finding something like Dunedin, I suppose. But we hit the world job market, and I was interviewed by an Australian university in Armidale, New England, I think, University of New England, I think it's called, strangely enough, in Armidale, Australia. At Massey University, their Auckland campus, University of Calgary in the Canadian Rockies, and Strathclyde in Glasgow. I got a lot of air miles that year, but the job offer came in from Massey. We accepted it, and that's how we ended up in New Zealand. But, of course, once we had discovered Dunedin, we knew, well, at some point we have to figure out a way to get down here, and eventually we did.
Oh, wow. And so you lecture here on what's your main area of research here? I'm the research director for the business school at the Polytech, and so I mostly lecture in business research methods, but I do some blocks of guest lectures in my specialty areas in other courses. So I still lecture and do research in areas related to social cognition, and these are, I guess we'd call them cross-cultural prejudices, stereotype-based prejudices or biases, sexism, racism, ageism. But my main area of research is really connected to what we call humanitarian work psychology. Humanitarian work psychology was a movement that came out of largely Massey University back in 2003. Stu Carr and I carpooled together for a few years and developed ideas and started to build a network internationally in the area of humanitarian work psychology. And it's a complicated name, but it really just means notions of industrial psychology or work psychology applied to humanitarian organizations or contexts, as well as general psychology applied to the arena of humanitarian work. So it's actually a fairly logical name for what we are. And there's probably now about 60 or 70 devotees or researchers around the world that are connected to humanitarian work psychology.
Can you back up just a tick and just give us a quick 101 on industrial psychology?
Industrial psychology is, as the name implies, psychological principles applied to industrial efforts or trying to improve industrial systems, optimize industrial outcomes, typically focused on improving the performance and the motivation and the well-being of workers in industry. The title is a bit misleading in the sense that we tend to interpret the word industrial to mean industrial parks, for instance, and industrial buildings and manufacturing activity. But that's a fairly small part of what industrial psychologists do. In this part of the world, we're more commonly referred to as organizational psychologists or maybe occupational psychologists. At Massey University, we called it business psychology, and Massey has a large program in that. But the core of it is trying to improve human performance inside organizational settings, improve health and well-being of the workforce, and improve organizational health at the same time.
How do you distance that from the Taylorist time and motion stuff that happened in the very start of that kind of work, and take that to a humanist perspective, where you're looking at well-being of the worker rather than the well-being of the corporation?
Well, that's a continuing struggle, and in fact, part of the reason for the creation of this new subdiscipline of humanitarian work psychology partially reflects the fact that the ethos in industrial psychology has generally been around the improving corporate outcomes, really, and taking care of those kinds of shareholders and those that narrowly defined subset of all the stakeholders. So I think that this movement is really reflecting the fact that we have been evolving over the past half century into having an increasingly humanist perspective amongst industrial psychologists. And it was finally time to make that salient by creating this new stream. And so now you're starting to see this stream represented at international and national level conferences of industrial psychologists, and that's a very good thing.
This program was first broadcast on Otago Access Radio and made with the assistance of New Zealand On Air.